Hey, let me ask you a question. When you're standing in a museum and taking in all the art, are you thinking somewhere in the back of your head, I wonder who they had to shake down to get all this art in this place? Today on the podcast, the art the British boldly took and the fight to get it back where it belongs. I'm Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. Listen, I'm always interested in the fact that museums are not neutral spaces. What you see in a museum is often the result of careful curation, and sometimes there are big fights over the things that actually belong there. For centuries, Greeks have been campaigning to get antiquities returned to their homeland, and the biggest example of this are the sculptures that were taken from the Parthenon. You might know them as the Elgin marbles, which are kept at the British Museum in London. And look, last week, the marbles were at the center of a diplomatic spat again. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak had been scheduled to meet with the Greek Prime Minister, that's a Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis in London, but it's believed that Sunak cancelled that meeting after the Greek Prime Minister said this in an interview with the BBC.
We feel that these sculptures belong to Greece and that they were essentially stolen, but this is not an ownership question. This is a reunification argument. Where can you best appreciate what is essentially one monument? I mean, if I told you that you would cut the Mona Lisa in half, and you would have half of it at the Louvre and half of it at the British Museum, do you think your viewers would appreciate the beauty of the painting in such a way? Well, this is exactly what happened with the Parthenon sculptures.
I mean, look, if you need proof that colonial attitudes are alive and well, look no further than the British Museum. Along with those sculptures, Britain has the Benin bronzes and diamonds plundered from South Asia. But I also don't want you thinking this is a distinctly British problem. It is not. Canadian museums are so full of Indigenous artifacts that were taken without permission. So to talk about where we're at and the way that we got here and the way that we get out, we've got Marc Fennell. He hosts the podcast Stuff the British Stole. Marc, welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
I'm happy that you're here, man. Listen, a canceled meeting between heads of state is like not a small thing. That's a really big deal in the world of diplomacy. How bad do things have to be for this to happen?
I will confess, after years of covering stolen artifacts and the heightened tensions around it, and as you pointed out, there are artifacts that have questionable parentage, questionable provenance all over the world. I've always been surprised by why the Parthenon marbles is such a hill to die on, right? It's not such a hill to die on for both the British and for the Greeks. Now, we've done an episode of the podcast about the Parthenon marbles, and the next season of the television series coming to CBC, we've also done an episode about the Parthenon marbles. And one of the reasons why I've been so keen to revisit it, and one of the reasons why this story has occupied my brain, is that whenever you talk about looted artifacts, it's the thing that people go to, right? It's the number one story that people come back to. And it kind of speaks to identity, right? For the Greeks, this is a building that, you know, in central Athens, you can't build higher than the Acropolis. It's so that everybody can look up to it. It has stood there for 2,000 years. Yeah. It has survived wars, fires, famine. It is part of their identity. And it has become that over the years. But central to that story is this idea of it being stolen, this idea of it being taken away. For the British, it occupies a completely different part of their mythology. For one, the British argument is that they bought and paid for it. And so the story behind that gets murky, right? Let me know if you want me to dive into it, because I'm all ready to go. I'm ready. I live and breathe this stuff.
I'm ready. I'm ready for you to do that, because one element of the story is that the British sort of say that their claim to the marbles is legitimate because they purchased them at a time when the ruling power of Greece, which was an occupying power, we should mention, had given them permission. But now there's kind of like maybe a question about whether such document even actually exists or not. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. So the story goes, there was this sort of mid-level aristocrat by the name of Lord Elgin from Scotland, and he was the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire from the British. At somewhere along the line, he had this sort of team. It wasn't him personally. He had a team of artists that he had acquired from around the world. They got there and they began this process of initially asking for, can we take bits and pieces to save it? Can we take bits and pieces to do research on? And it was a bit of a case of don't ask for permission, ask for forgiveness after you've done it.
Yeah.
And you're right. There is, in charge of Athens at this particular point in time were not the Greek people. It was the Ottoman Empire. And there has been this suggestion over the years that Elgin and his team had permission from the Ottoman Empire. Here's the problem. The original document doesn't exist. No one's ever been able to find it. What does exist is an English translation that was produced many years later and presented to British Parliament as like, hey, we got permission, it's all good. But there's layers to that, right? Because as you point out, the Greeks were not in charge of their own land at the time. The Ottomans were. Essentially, what you're looking at is permission from at best Ottoman middle management as to who gets to do this. And I think it's worth pointing out that even at the time, even when this was happening, people were critical of it. So Lord Byron, the poet, the very famous British poet, he writes at the time about how scandalous it was that they were taking this incredible temple down. This has been controversial right the way through. This isn't a case of us looking back from 2023 and using our lens to judge the past.
It's like for 200 years it's been fought over. Yeah. Yeah,
exactly. And I think there are some kinks in that argument. One, which is that many people have argued that Elgin saved the marbles because they were they weren't in great shape when his people started collecting. That is true. So there'd been a massive explosion. It had been used as why somebody thought this was a smart idea to use it as a munitions store, I'll never know. And a lot of tourists had looted it. So it wasn't like it was in the best shape either.
Sure.
So there is this argument that's been put up that he saved it. And the argument's changed over the years. For a long time, the British said, well, hey, I mean, you guys couldn't possibly, look after this. And as a result, the Greeks made their own museum. It's insane when you think about it.
Yeah.
As a response to that criticism. So I think what's happened is because it's been a 200-year-old argument, it has almost metastasized in a way. I can't see either of them ever changing their position.
Right.
The British have occasionally talked about loans, but the Greeks in general won't accept the idea of a loan because part of a loan is acknowledging that it legally belongs to the British, which the Greeks, in my opinion, will never accept.
I'm interested in the fact that the Greek Prime Minister said, you know what, it's kind of like displaying half the Mona Lisa. Does that ring true for you?
It's funny. They've been using the argument about the Mona Lisa for about 100 years. And it's if you talk to anybody who's ever been associated with the arguments with the negotiation for bringing the British Museum, they always come back to that as a comparison. I think it's fair. I think it's one of their key arguments because they've built that museum. So that museum, you can see bits and pieces that were left behind, and they've filled out the collection with replicas and just empty spots. I think the Greeks feel like they have a better cut through if it's not about repatriation and if they make it about reunification. Even though it's a stalemate, and it's been a stalemate for 2 centuries, right?
Yeah.
What's interesting is that the arguments put up by both sides have changed over time, right? So for the longest time, the British said, well, you couldn't possibly put these artifacts back on the Acropolis, they'd be damaged. Then at different points, the Greeks have kind of created different arguments. There's been conversations about using international law, for example, using the UN. What's intriguing about it for me is even though the facts of the matter haven't really changed, you can see the tussle over time has evolved. I think in this particular case, the argument of reunification is more palatable, or they think it's more palatable, is because it feels like more of an affront. But the act of bringing them together feels like justice. It doesn't feel like nationalism. If you know what I mean? I think part of why that argument's been put up is a sense that it's less of a nationalistic, perhaps even seen as an aggressive idea to take something from some place that's looked after it and bring it home. Yeah. If they sell this idea, this warm and fuzzy idea of reunification, my personal feeling is that it's fair, it's accurate, and it probably still won't work.
I'm really stuck on the emotions in this, the ways that the emotion plays into the story. Right? You describe what you call a deep rage that exists in Greece and in the Greek diaspora because the marbles represent so much to them.
It's part of us. The idea of democracy found its expression in Periclean Athens, and that monument atop the Acropolis basically embodies that.
That's George Vardos. He's vice president of a group called Australians for the Return of the Parthenon Sculptures. And that's his take on why these marbles matter so much, the idea of democracy itself. Is that your sense of it too?
When we started this series, the first series of it, I didn't do the Parthenon marbles because I felt in the series, I was like, oh, what could I possibly add to this story?
People already know the story, yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's probably the most famous version of it. Let's go find stories people don't know about. And I was inundated. Where we set up an email address with CBC and the ABC, we set up an email address for people to kind of suggest things for us to do. And I was blown away by the sheer number of Greek people in Canada or Australia, all of these different countries, America, emailing me going, why don't you do this? And I underestimated how deep that sense of loss was, not just for Greeks in Greece, but for Greeks everywhere. And it took me a while through making the podcast and also making the TV series to understand. And I think the key to understanding it is to go back in time. When the Parthenon marbles were taken, the Greeks were not in charge of their own land. They were occupied, as you said. They were occupied by the Ottoman Empire. If you look at the years that followed, the strife, the political turmoil, the wars, the famine, Greeks have been through a lot.
Yeah.
And yet they've always been able to look, if you live in Athens, they've always been able to look up at this symbol. They have this intense pride over things that are born of Greece, democracy, and these big, huge ideas that have shaped art and culture and politics.
Yeah.
They have this incredible legacy, and yet the evidence of their ownership does not reside on their land. There is an injustice there that is entwined with pride. And if you have this pride, the entire world uses Greek ideas, right? Has built political systems out of Greek ideas. And yet the most stunning examples of that were taken, in, let's just be diplomatic, extremely dodgy circumstances. Yeah. I think that you kind of have to kind of understand that the pride is matched with a sense of injustice. And
right.
It's taken me years to understand that.
I mean, first of all, you do not have to be diplomatic on this show. Mark, if you want to be undiplomatic, that is totally, totally welcome. Let's just put it bluntly here and say, like, the brand of colonialism is not doing well, Mark. It's 2023. We're looking at the idea of colonialism as like, oh, that was like a fixture of how modern society is shaped, but maybe generally not a good idea. That's the way we're looking at these things. But then when we come to museums, it kind of feels like a different approach, because when you look at the British Museum, for example, it has all these things. It has the Benin bronzes from Nigeria, the Rosetta Stone, which is clearly not British. It belongs in Egypt, diamonds from South Asia. I could go on and on and on. What is getting in the way, do you think, of those items being returned to where we know they came from, aside from holding on to the remnants of actually colonialism was like good for something? Because that's the only argument I can think of as like the reason why you would still keep them in Britain. And if you wanted to go, I think we might be done with the legacy of colonialism, maybe you'd start there. Well,
it's interesting because we'll never be done with the legacy of colonialism.
Sure.
And this is a big part of why I make the show, right?
Yeah.
Which is, at the end of the day, you and I wouldn't be here without the British Empire, for
True.
better or worse. Like,
that's true.
The only reason you and I can even understand each other, this language that we're speaking, is because some way or another along that line, you and I were touched by the British Empire. Now, is that an entirely good thing, an entirely bad thing? It's probably neither.
That's a lot to say with. You've given me a lot to say with already, but continue. Yes.
It's partly why Stuff the British Style isn't just about artifacts. It's about us. It's always been about, can an object sitting in a museum open a doorway to look at? How is it that we got to where we are now? Where is the direct line that you can draw to that? And invariably, the way that history was taught for, a couple of hundred years was like, the British came, they civilized, and everything was fine. You were a dominion. Congratulations, now
Right.
you're a country. And I think one of the interesting reasons why this is a show that comes from Canada and Australia is because we have this unusual we have these unusual overlaps in our history, but we're not the same by any stretch of the imagination. But I often say that the story is different, but the melody is familiar. You look back over how colonialism operated in Canada and Australia. And one of the reasons why I think museums are a perfect doorway to look at colonialism is because the classic British Museum, until quite recently, has viewed itself as separate from that world. It's like, we just take the things and we're a dispassionate document of the world. We are not the story, right? And I think a big part of why museums are good to examine is because they viewed themselves for the longest time as being static environments. We just collect it, put it together. Here's the picture of the world. Mm-hmm. We all now know that that's not true, that these places were built by, rich dudes with top hats and money, who viewed themselves in a hierarchy as, we're at the top and we're going to examine the rest of the world and look at the person from, India and, the people we've colonized. Like they're viewing, those buildings are built with a view from above, right? And anyone that says otherwise kind of not really being honest with themselves. Now, of course, the people that work in museums and galleries these days, let's be honest, by and large, they are people that are interested in knowledge and sharing understanding. And they've twisted the argument over the years to being like, well, we have it now. It's still the best record of the world. Do you want to dismantle it? Come on now.
Yeah.
And I think museums and galleries hide behind politeness, right? I think there's a lot of things, like I wouldn't have a show if their plaques were just a bit more honest, to be honest with you. Like I think if their plaques were just a bit like, hey, like we shot a guy, but we're going to call it a gift.
Sure.
I just think if they were just a bit more honest, I'd be like, you know what, you don't need me.
Yeah.
You've done it. You've done the job.
Yeah, you came forward. You came with the truth. Yes.
Like honestly, like if not every object should necessarily be returned. Not every community of origin necessarily wants their objects returned. Right. Some people, many people, in fact, are really thrilled to have their culture spread around the world. But they would, by and large, prefer it if the plaques there told the truth about how it got there. Was it? Yeah. I was talking to this fabulous museum curator on Haida Gwaii off the coast of not too far from Vancouver, and he's like, they work with museums and galleries around the world to rewrite the plaques for Haida art, right? And a lot of what they do is they take the word purchased or collected and they just replace it with the word bought under duress, and like they're just like, we're just like giving a better set of words back to museums and galleries. And it's not true of every piece of Haida antiquity around the world, but one of the consistent things they say is like, that came out of the conversation at least, is like, we like having our art and culture spread around the world, but we'd like you to be honest about how you got it. Right. I was like, okay. So I think they're not static environments is the thing. There has been a lot of change. Museums and galleries around the world have changed massively just in the last 2-3 years since I've been doing this show. I'm not suggesting that's because of me, but there is a long way to go, and politeness is the enemy of truth sometimes because history is messy. Yeah. One of the issues with the British Museum, and actually this is probably more useful, is one of the biggest challenges with the British Museum is there's a law that would need to change for them to give something back. Right. So their argument is that we can't just give things back. There's a law preventing us from giving things back, and an act of parliament would have to change. And of course, no government in the UK is interested in changing that law. And so what happens is the British Museum and the British government get to kind of bounce off each other and blame each other. It has been pointed out to me that there are plenty of exceptions where they've done it in the past. It's also their argument for why they like the idea of the long-term loan. It means they don't have to change a law. Yeah. But then, of course, the Greeks are like, we don't accept this idea that we'd have to agree to something being officially considered British law. Also, I've heard privately from people over the years in the British Museum that they literally don't trust. They literally don't trust if they gave them over, even as a loan, they'd get them back. But that's hearsay.
They probably, listen. No. It's very helpful to me, Marc, that you spent 3 seasons making this podcast. You have years and years of research and experience under your belt. I'd love to know if anyone is getting all of this right. Like, is anyone doing this correctly?
Oh, yeah. Look, I think lots of museums and galleries are actually working really hard on this. It's funny. Somebody said to me in an interview the other day, it's like, how do you feel about being the bane of museums and galleries' existence? I was like, I love museums and galleries. The whole way this thing started was me standing in a museum and just wondering, how on earth did you get here? Like, yeah. To me, museums and galleries are these beautiful boxes filled with mysteries. But at the same time, you scratch the surface of them and you go, well, hold on, why are you here? And it's because, some rich dude with the top hat was like, I'm going to collect things from around the world and I'm going to be very popular with my friends.
Yeah.
And, like, you can still love it in the moment and then ask hard questions of how it got there. These are not mutually exclusive ideas. I think we can do both. I think museums and galleries around the world are working very hard. And I give credit where it's due. They're working very hard to find either palatable ways of telling history or trying to be honest about how things got there, trying to engage with definitely First Nations communities. I would argue less so with immigrant communities, and I think that's something that should be worked on across the board, across the remains of the empire. I would also say that the part of the challenge is that they are mostly uncomfortable with people from outside telling their stories. And I get it, I do, but they are organizations that haven't faced a lot of scrutiny until quite recently. And you can tell, right? You can tell that these are institutions that are so used to being regarded as a broad social good. Who would possibly say something bad about a museum? I think they're so used to this idea of being regarded as a broad social good that it's been a pretty steep learning curve for a lot of museums and galleries to realize we're under the spotlight. And how we got these things is under the spotlight. And I give a lot of credit to the museums and galleries that do open up and talk. Yeah. And it's been interesting over the years of just doing the show, both the podcast and the TV series, of just like watching museums and galleries weigh up, should we talk about this? And I'm always really impressed when because it's always an awkward conversation. It's always an awkward conversation. And I think if you're going to sell yourself as a place of knowledge and understanding and truth, you have to accept that you yourself need to be part of that conversation. You are not static.
Yeah.
You are not you're not floating above social affairs and issues. You are one. And I think the British Museum at some point something's going to have to change. I don't know what it'll be. Like, I don't think those laws are going to change anytime soon, and I don't think the Greeks are going to give up. But it has gone on for so long, and it's become the hill that both the Greeks and the British Museum have chosen to die on. At some point, culture will tick over a line where they will have to change something. And there are a million ideas for how this can be done. You can give them back to Greece and replace that room with replicas. You could replace it with virtual reality so you could see what it will look. There's so many, like, we're at an age where you could do so many different things to maintain your purposes as a home of knowledge and understanding, while still giving these objects back that have so much almost spiritual significance to the people of Athens. It's doable, but something has to change, and I don't know what that is yet.
Marc, the quote that's going to stick out for me is, "You are not floating above social issues. You are one." I think that's a really good takeaway. I think that's a really good place to leave it. I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for being on the show, man.
Thank you for having me and letting me ramble. I'm sorry.
Hey, I'm delighted that you did.
Pleasure's entirely mine.
Marc Fennell hosts Stuff the British Stole. It is a podcast and a TV show co-produced by the Australian public broadcaster ABC and the CBC. You can watch the show on CBC Gem. Hey, that is it for the podcast today. But tomorrow we are talking about something that is deeply important to me. Maybe it's important to you too, and that is The OC, okay? The teen drama that premiered about 20 years ago is now turning 20. There is a new oral history about its influence, the influence of that show. And on this podcast, we are going to have Stephanie Savage, who's one of the executive producers of The OC, and Josh Schwartz, who's the creator of The OC. And in case you can't tell, I'm a little bit excited about this one because I'm deeply invested in it. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. Hey, if you have a moment, if you don't mind, heading over to our Instagram at CommotionCBC and just hitting that follow button. You can get a lot of extra content on our Instagram, so join us there. In the meantime, I'm going to see you tomorrow. I hope to see you then.